Hey everybody, good morning and welcome back to Apocalypse Now, our Bible study about the end of the world. Today we are going to dive into talking about the book of Revelation. And we're going to begin by talking a little bit about what we're bringing into this conversation together. So, firstly, we've talked together in the course of our time together thus far about apocalypse as a genre, not just as an event, but more specifically as a genre. Because as you look at the sweep of biblical scholarship and the sweep of books of the ancient world, there's actually a lot of mention of apocalypse, and it arrives as a whole genre unto itself. A genre defined as a set of literature that has some common themes. One is there's a revelation. Remember, the word apocalypse itself comes from the Greek word which means to unveil or reveal. And so there's a revelation that's mediated often through vivid imagery and mystical visions. Often, secondly, that vision is given to a scared and confused person who is led by an otherworldly creature or otherworldly person. Thirdly, this genre of apocalypse describes a dualistic world, a world, in other words, that is split into everything being either all good or all bad. And at the end of things, the ultimate good ultimately wins. And then lastly, often apocalypses are meant to be read not just as descriptions of the future, or in many cases, not at all descriptions of the future, but rather visions of a future that are actually describing a present. And so last time we were together on Zoom, we talked about the book of Daniel and how the four beasts and the beasts with the 10 horns and the three horns that were plucked out and the one horn that grew out wasn't necessarily a vision of events to come, but was rather a description of the various empires that had taken control of Judea, and how you can see pretty clearly that there are these literary allusions to historical events that were taking place in this region in the transition from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire to the Greek Empire, and so on. And when we dive into Revelation, we're bringing all of those conversations into this one. But of course, we're also bringing all the conversations and all that we've learned, not just these past few weeks, but in some cases over our lifetimes. The book of Revelation is a book of the Bible that is widely talked about, particularly in certain Christian religious traditions. And so I'm going to open it up a little bit now to ask y'all, what are you bringing to this conversation? When you think about the book of Revelation, what comes to mind for you?
Better get saved.
Better get saved. All right.
Yeah, I guess that makes me think of rapture too, but I'm stuck in that future thing. I always thought of it as a fortune telling thing. I never really have put it in that good present day type thing too. So that was good to hear.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Keith. We'll definitely come back to that as we think about Revelation and what contemporary events to its time it might be referring to. What else comes to mind? We've got rapture, we've got you better get saved. What are the images or thoughts come to mind when you think of the book of Revelation?
Fire.
Yeah, I always picture the Grim Reaper. That's one of my symbols for Revelations.
Yeah,
Lots of death and destruction.
death and destruction. Yeah, fire, grim. Yep, that pretty much sums it up. Some other things that often get mentioned when talking about and thinking about the book of Revelation are the number 666, that mark of the beast. We'll talk some about that. The four horsemen, pestilence, famine, war, that whole bundle. But all of this is to say, these are just more specific versions of death and destruction. And so let's talk a little bit about the book itself. So, our first question we might consider is, well, who wrote the book of Revelation? Here's how the book of Revelation begins. It's also known as the Apocalypse of John. It's more traditionally, technically known as the Apocalypse of John, but we know it as the book of Revelation because, again, the way that word apocalypse gets translated. So, here's how the book of Revelation begins. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant, who testified to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Okay, so that's kind of a technically challenging sentence, I think, in some ways, when you kind of look at the syntax, who's he and which and all of that referring to. But basically what we have is right here at the onset in verse 1, this description of kind of a hierarchy of revelation. God gives revelation to Jesus. Jesus gives it to an angel gives it to John. And then you see that word servant kind of mentioned all the way down, right? And so John is ultimately receiving this information by way of an angel who received it from Jesus, who received it from God. So we're talking about John, but who? What John are we referring to? And traditionally, and this is partly why the book of Revelation even makes it into the Christian canon, the New Testament, because there was a lot of debate when the canon was being formed as to whether or not the book of Revelation should even be included. Ultimately, the reason why those folks who were consolidating the books of the New Testament into a canon decided to include Revelation was because it was believed that Revelation was written by John, son of Zebedee, brother of James, one of the disciples of Jesus. However, even in the 2nd century, when the New Testament was being formed, there was a lot of debate about that. There were ancient Christian writers who said that they did not believe that this was John, son of Zebedee, based on a whole variety of things. One being that John, son of Zebedee, in his Gospels and in the letters, 1st and 2nd John, never mentions the fact that his name is John. And also the way that the imagery, the way that the grammar, and a variety of other things take place in Revelation leads some ancient Christian writers, even then, to say that this wasn't really written by John. Nevertheless, it makes its way into the canon as an official book of the New Testament. So, now let's talk a little bit about what this person named John wrote. There's hundreds of ways to offer a summary of the book of Revelation. However, for today, for this next 50 minutes or so, we're going to focus on two things in particular. One is the stated intent of the book. And then secondly, we're going to talk about some of the recurring images, particularly as it relates to the number 7. Firstly, the intent of this book. So, here's how John describes it. John says, or the author says, "Look, he is coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. So it is to be. Amen. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. The He that's being described here is a reference to Jesus. And so, look, Jesus is coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him. Then we move from there into, this is now in verse 9, I, John, your brother. Notice how we went from in the very first verse, John was talked about in the third person. John was a person that received this revelation. Now we're in the first person. I, John, your brother, who share with you the persecution and the kingdom and the endurance in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now, just to be clear, John is on the island called Patmos, not because the word of God and the testimony of Jesus led him there, told him to go there, but because he was exiled there, because he was preaching the word of God and held fast to the testimony of Jesus. So this is a person who's in exile. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write in a book what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea." So here we have, right in these first few verses, a declaration about who this is for, who this revelation is for, the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Okay. So here are those 7 churches. In modern day Turkey, this was a province of the Roman Empire during this time when this book was written. And so we have these 7 churches here. Ephesus was considered sort of the center of gravity for these 7 churches, but also for the entire province. You notice it's a port city, and it was sort of this bustling town where there was all this diversity and commerce and trade happening. Okay, so this address is to these 7 churches. Now, John says, now we're in verse 12, then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Humanity, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash across his chest. It also says that he had a tongue like 2 swords. So that's why there's this kind of floating sword here. And here's John bowing down before that vision. All right, so we're only now we're going from verse 12. We're skipping around just a little bit. Now we're moving into verse 17. And then we'll pause for a second and kind of take stock of what we've read so far. When I saw him, the one like a Son of Humanity, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he placed his right hand on me, saying, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Now write what you have seen, what is and what is to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches themselves." Okay. It's a lot packed into the first 20 verses. A lot of imagery, a lot of declaration. What stood out to y'all, if anything?
Well, the number 7 is pretty significant.
The number 7 comes up a lot, doesn't it, Diane? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too that, so John's receiving this vision, right? We kind of go from a general description, this third person description of John receiving this revelation. Then we move into John claiming it, and now he's writing in the first person. And within that, he has these figures who tell him to write this down. Write down what you're about to see. And then, not only do they tell him to write down the vision that they're about to give him or experience alongside him, the figure starts interpreting it and says, hey, you notice those 7 stars that I had in my right hand and those 7 lampstands around me? I'm going to go ahead and let you know those refer to certain things. Those 7 stars refer to the 7 angels that govern those 7 churches, which are represented by the lampstands. Any other thoughts, comments, reactions, questions to that chunk of revelation we've gotten so far?
I'll step in here. At the very beginning, I think it's verse 3 where blessed is he who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. I'm seeing the guy on the street corner who I've been seeing my whole life. It's like, oh, that's where he came from.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Dennis. We didn't read that piece of it together. But in verse 3, John says, blessed are those who read this aloud. And then later, at the very end, John writes, the author named John writes, if anyone changes any word of this revelation, they will deny themselves entry into the kingdom of God. And so there's, at the beginning and at the end, John's making clear, this is something you better not tamper with, and you need to be sure to pay attention to it. And so it's interesting, Dennis, that you're kind of drawing that connection with people that we see on the side of the street preaching, the kingdom is near, repent. It's sort of a long tradition that kind of goes back to at least this book and the tradition that this book itself sets up. Speaking of that tradition, let's talk a little bit about some other places where we see it manifest itself in the Bible. So we have this moment with the 7 lampstands, the 7 churches. Again, John, we go from a general description of John, who's this person who receives revelation, to this first person account of him writing it down. Let's compare this with the book of Daniel we talked about last time. Here we are in the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel. If you remember back, most scholars believe the book of Daniel is sort of a compilation of stories that are drawn from a couple of different sources. In fact, the book of Daniel in its original context, if you look at the original manuscript, is written in 2 different languages, actually. And so in the first 6 chapters, it's a general description sharing stories of people who persevere in the midst of persecution. In chapters 7 through 12, it's a series of visions. And so here we are at the beginning of those visions. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. And then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. So here we are in the kind of the prologue, very much like the book of Revelation, the prologue to these visions. Now let's take a look. Now we're in verses 13 through 15 in this chunk here, and then going on in just 18. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a son of humanity coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. I approached one of the attendants to ask him the truth concerning all this. So he said that he would disclose to me the interpretation of the matter. So here, right off the bat, the first chunk of the visions of Daniel and the first few passages in the book of Revelation, some themes emerge. One, We have this revelation that is given by and interpreted by this otherworldly being. Second, that being goes with the seer. That being accompanies John. That being accompanies Daniel throughout their visions. And then the vision itself and the circumstances around the vision are terrifying. Both John and Daniel talk about how scared they were as they were in the midst of seeing all of this. So again, we see this genre, right? These themes in this genre emerge, that there are certain kinds of consistencies that we see across these two different books. One written probably around the 2nd century BCE, the other, that was Daniel, the other, the book of Revelation, written anywhere between 60 and 90 CE, after the death of Christ. So let's talk about some of these recurring images in the book of Revelation. Again, we've got the number 7, as Diane mentioned, and as many of us have already been thinking about. We have one, this address to 7 churches. And then from the address to those 7 churches, we see the seven stars and the Son of Humanity's hand, the 7 lampstands, and then we see an appearance of a scroll with 7 seals, that only a slaughtered lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes can open. This is a stained glass window in a church where you can see this lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns, and then here we have this book that has 7 seals on it. And what follows from here is the opening up of all of the destruction, terror, and in some cases later on, beauty and salvation that come. This, by the way, was probably the tamest depiction of the 7-eyed, 7-horned lamb that I could find. Some of them were pretty terrifying. We'll talk about this in our next Tuesday class, just the movement within apocalypticism as this kind of social reality. A lot of contemporary Christians have taken images from the book of Revelation and created what are essentially kind of horror comic books. And so you can actually find a lot of images of these visions on the internet. So if you ever like to be scared a little bit, feel free to just look these up. So then out of the 7 seals, one by one, Revelation continues. More vision, more imagery emanates out of these 7 seals. And then so we move from the 7-eyed, 7-horned lamb that's opening these 7 seals into a cascade, the first of which are the 4 horsemen, that with each seal that is opened, another horseman comes. And so here's a depiction of those horsemen coming, and they bring destruction, all of them, in one way or another, whether it be war or famine or death. When we get to the 5th seal, then the souls of martyrs are on display. Then we get to the 6th seal, and an earthquake comes. But before we open the 7th seal, we see this interesting kind of interlude where John learns that 144,000 people will be saved. And when you look at this section, it's in chapter 7 of the book of Revelation. When you look at this section, there's as the destruction is taking place, but before it's completely unleashed, the angels pause everything and say, we need to mark 12,000 people from 12 different tribes of Israel in order to name and make clear who is going to be spared all of this destruction. So that number, 144,000, this is one of those places where that number shows up. And so here's a depiction of the the angels pausing everything and marking each individual person on their forehead. So this is in verse 4. However, interestingly, in verse 9, it says, a countless multitude is saved. And so there's a little bit of, it's one of those moments that we see often in ancient texts, but also particularly in the Bible, where there's a little bit of disagreement there. Is it 144,000 or is it a countless multitude? But those people, 144,000 / a countless multitude, they receive a song of promise about their protection. They will be protected from everything that is to come. So then, I'm just going to kind of move through these different series of 7 a little bit quickly, and then we'll pause and talk together. But if you have questions along the way, please feel free to just stop me. So then we move from those six seals being revealed, the moment of pause, where the 144,000 are marked, and then the 7th seal opens. And what follows the 7th seal opening is actually 30 minutes. The book of Revelation reads about a half hour of complete silence. And then 7 angels receive 7 trumpets that release various plagues and forms of destruction. That moment of complete silence, though, is really interesting. And what many interpreters believe is that this is an attempt to kind of echo the beginning of time, that this is sort of a reset of all creation. And so how did time begin in the book of Genesis? With silence, with void. And so this moment of complete quiet, many believe, is an attempt to echo that very first moment in creation. Then what follows are these seven angels with 7 trumpets, and each trumpet releases a new form of destruction. There is one trumpet releases hail and fire that rains down. There's darkness that overcomes the earth. There's another trumpet that releases a poisoning of rivers. And then we get to this really curious moment where there are these locusts that are released that have faces like humans, teeth like lions, and wings. And they also have stingers like scorpions. And their charge is to go and torture everyone who's not one of the 144,000. And so here you see them, the angel blowing its trumpet, and then these locust-like creatures being released and just tromping upon defenseless people who have not been marked as one of the 144,000. And so, where this leads, once we get to the 6th trumpet, here again, there's a little bit of an interlude. Just like we saw with this after we got through the 6th seal, there was that moment of pause. Here again in the story, there's another moment of pause before the 7th trumpet. And in this little moment of pause, in this interlude, John is presented with a scroll that he eats. And he talks about how sweet it is. And it's meant to be a kind of reference to prophecy that he's internalizing. And then we get to the 7th trumpet. And throughout all of this destruction of the 6 trumpets, we learn that about 1/3 of humanity has been destroyed. Again, and that's not including the 144,000. So again, this sort of unraveling of creation by means of, in many cases, pretty horrific destruction. So then, after that, after those 7 trumpets, following the 7 seals, we lead into a vision of 7 different spiritual figures. The first of which are a woman and a dragon. And this woman is pregnant. and she's about to give birth. And the dragon's aim is to eat the child that she's going to give birth to. And so here she is with the dragon right nearby. And essentially, what happens is that some divine figures take the child and then swoop the woman away to be protected for 1,000 plus days. The dragon fails in its mission, but then that leads to other beasts being revealed, one of which is the beast that's marked with 666. Okay, let me pause here. A lot of intense imagery, a lot of violence, a lot of curious amalgamations of different kinds of creatures happening here. What are y'all's reactions just as you hear this, as you have read it or reread it or what have you, just at an emotional level? What comes up for you?
Anxiety.
Yeah.
Straight out terror.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who are the 24 elders in 16? Then 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God.
There's a suggestion. So this is in chapter 1 in verse 16. There's a description of this grand throne that's decked out in gemstones, and that around that throne there are 24 elders. And what folks think is that those are allusions to the 12 disciples and then the 12 leaders from the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's how we add up to 24. But, this brings up the point that this is a book that has puzzled readers, faith-filled readers or not, since ever. Since it was included in the canon of the New Testament. People have lots of different ideas about what these images might point to, how to read them, whether to read them as allegory, kind of as a big system of metaphors that are referring to other kinds of realities, or to read it as literal prediction of events that will take place. I will say that as I understand it, looking at kind of the sweep of different interpretations, the more literalist interpretations are the minority and they're more contemporary. There were not the vast majority of readers of Revelation in the first centuries were not convinced that these were specific events that would take place with any immediacy. That didn't mean that they didn't think Jesus was coming back, but they also were aware, according to historians, that a lot of these images were pointing to different kinds of historical realities that were contemporary to them. So let's talk a little bit. Yeah, John.
What I've been drawing out of it is first, really confusing. Second, opaque. And then I go back to, well, silence. Silence. To me, that's where the understanding must reside. And so as long as I'm trying to make sense, in quotes, of all of this, the more I'll fall behind, it seems, the more confusing it becomes. So for me, I'm trying to find a method or a way that will point, if you will, and it just keeps coming back silence. It's not here. It's in the heart somehow. That's all.
I appreciate that, John, very much. As we kind of think about how to situate these writings, kind of in contemporary literary forms. Certainly, we've got this idea of it being an apocalypse, but a lot of folks have written similarly, John, that a way to understand this is as poetry, in the sense that it's not necessarily every bit of it is verse, although there are lots of the book of Revelation that are in verse, that follow a standard meter and follow certain kind of poetic conventions. But in the sense that when you read poetry, it's not supposed to always make sense to you. You're not supposed to necessarily always be using your intellectual faculties in order to understand it. In some cases, the goal is to simply receive it. Now, with this, that's all well and good when you're talking about flowers and puppies and rivers and forests, but when the images you're receiving are of locusts with human heads and lion teeth that are trampling people's bodies, you start to wonder, why would I want to submit to this? Why would I want to internalize it or let it wash over me or what have you? And there's a couple of ways we might answer that. Yeah, Fran, what are you thinking about?
Just by what you said, Pastor, all the while I'm sitting here listening and seeing all these images, and I said, oh, this is unbelievable. To me, it's like, okay, I've got to take it, on that plane of being unbelievable, but yet, what is its purpose?
Yeah, that gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Why was this book written? What's it for? Who's it for? Well, let's talk a little bit about the context around it. So this book was written, again, the estimations vary, anywhere from between 60 or 70 CE or around 90 CE. So what that means is that it was either written during the reign of the Emperor Nero or the reign of the Emperor Domitian. And why there's a debate about that is because it all comes down to how you interpret certain images and visions in the book of Revelation and what they're referring to. And so regardless, though, what's notable is that it was under the reign of Emperor Nero that Christians, as a religious sect, first started to be systematically persecuted. Now, this wasn't, we were not in the time yet where the Roman Empire just really amped up and started looking for Christians. The Roman Empire had, for most of its history, a policy of saying, you can maintain whatever religious beliefs you have, just as long as you also make sure that you go and visit the temples of the Roman gods, particularly the temples of Caesar, where there were times eventually in Roman government, Caesar, the emperor, sort of took on this deified quality. And so essentially the idea was, practice whatever religious or spiritual beliefs you have, but make sure you maintain allegiance to the Roman Empire and remember that you are subjects of the Roman Empire. Christians, however, refused to do that in many cases. And so they were persecuted. They were exiled. They were just sent somewhere else. They were also crucified. They were also set on fire. There was a whole variety of ways of persecuting Christians. The most common, according to historians, was exile. And so here we are. This brings us back to John, this person who is naming that he is on the island of Patmos. And he's naming that because he's saying right away, I get it. Which he says in the very beginning verses, right? Your brother, John, I know the persecution that you're undergoing. And so he's writing these visions to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, the part of the Roman Empire where he lived. He's writing this. One, perhaps we could understand it as a vision for what's to come. It's possible. That he believed that this was a prediction of future events. It's possible, though, too, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's also almost certain that he wrote this as a means of comforting and strengthening a persecuted religious minority. When you look at what happens to everyone who's not the 144,000, it's horrific. And you could read it as vengeful, actually, that the people who aren't protected, who aren't believers, they're going to suffer terrible calamity. Because there's moments throughout the book of Revelation where it's mentioned how they refuse to bow before God, or how they refuse to pledge their allegiance to Christ or the Lamb or what have you. And so we can read this also as a revenge tale against people who've persecuted Christians, in particular John. But then we can also read it as a kind of celebration, actually, of a God who has all of history within that God's control. So all of the things that you're experiencing right now, don't worry, because God's going to make it right in the end. And so one really clear example of that is...
Pastor, I have to interject just what
Yeah.
you just said. Repeat what you just said, that statement.
Yeah, so it's...
Make it at the end.
Exactly, that you worship a God who actually has all of history within God's hands. And
this is what Christianity did for us as slaves. So where we were, we had to realize that in the end, the revelation, it was going to be better.
yeah. You know, there's a really well-known biblical scholar, well-known in the world of biblical scholarship, named Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who is a feminist biblical scholar, and she actually writes about the book of Revelation as a liberation book, as a book that's about God's righting of historical wrongs in this really dramatic way. She doesn't believe that this is literally going to take place, but what she sees in the way that Revelation unfolds is this promise that God is a God who sides with the oppressed and will do work to right the wrongs of history. And so one example that we see of that in the book of Revelation is the mention of, quote, the whore of Babylon. And so here's how, this is chapter 18, verses 7 through 8 read. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her prostitution. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon, the great mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. But the angel said to me, "Why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come." So, a lot of biblical scholars believe that this is a reference to Rome itself. In the ancient world, and still today, cities are often referred to with feminine pronouns. And so the idea was that Babylon, which recurs throughout and is mentioned many times throughout the book of Revelation, is actually an allusion to Rome. And so the whore of Babylon is meant to be Rome itself, and she's riding upon this beast, which many believe refers to Nero. And so this beast, and so here again, we see the number, this number reference, 666. What does that mean? Where does it come from? There's a movie, End of Days, that features Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know if any of y'all have seen it. It's a horror movie. And there's a priest in that movie who says, End of Days, in End of Days, the reference to 666, in dreams, numbers can appear backwards and upside down. And so he has this car and he turns it and it's 999. And so the whole thing, this movie came out in like 1998 or so, that it's actually an allusion to 1999, so that Revelation will unfold in 2000, Y2K vibes happening all over the place. But in fact, what a lot of ancient historians believe is that the number 666 is considered this word gematria is a reference to a practice where you would basically assign a numerical value to every letter in an alphabet. And so when you do that, which was very common in the ancient world, particularly in sort of mystical and mystery spiritualities, when you do that and you add those numbers up for the name Nero Caesar, you get the number 666. And so the idea is that it's actually this kind of subversive way to very directly point to Nero himself. And so, again, we get this sense that what's being referred to and what's being referenced is not necessarily just some future event that happens with all these fantastical creatures, but that this is actually political commentary on contemporary events that were taking place. The persecution of Christians under the Roman Empire. And then, at a very personal level, John of Patmos, who himself had been persecuted and exiled to this island where he lived out the rest of his days. As you think about that approach to the book of Revelation and this approach to apocalypse, how does it sit with you? Does it feel like it makes sense? Does it feel like it's making meaning of this text? Does it feel like it is maybe kind of a flat academic way to approach the Bible? How's it sit with you at this point?
For me, it sounds more logical that it is in the time period that it was written. And so the images, et cetera, would come from the thinking processes of the people of that time and the writers. So if that's the case, then I think back to, okay, here it is, 1,000, 2,000 years later. What meaning would it possibly have for us? If you get my drift.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, someone suggested at one of our last sessions that it would be interesting when we were looking at the book of Daniel, it would be interesting, given the way we kind of tracked the way the beasts in the book of Daniel tracked with certain ancient empires. It would be interesting to think about, well, what would be the beasts of our time? What would be the Babylon of today? How might we think about the realities of persecution in our own perspectives, from our own lives?
Pastor, you just explained. I mean, actually, I wondered about this. You know, in the Black church of years ago, you know, the revelation was preached, and I understand. And I mean, I'm talking about like in the 20s and in the 30s, you know, giving hope to that congregation, you know, that this beast will be, you know, eliminated, you know, in the hereafter. You know, hold on to this Christian belief. So now I'm beginning to see that, you know, why that was preached. We had to have some type of hope, you know, at being an oppressed population in the United States. And so, and with Christianity being our religion, you know, that revelation gave us hope.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, because in the book of Revelation, we see a God who is in complete control of things and working to, in a way, right wrongs. And the way that happens, of course, is through tremendous suffering and destruction. Um, and so, you know, we can read into that an immense amount of resentment or an immense amount of pain that is being shared or foisted upon the perpetrators of that pain. You know, that might be one way to think about it.
It's a struggle for me in the inevitability and apparent, I don't know the word for it, passivity of those unto whom all this is being done. In other words, you're not going to get out of it. It will come through, but it's hard for me to see that it's writhing in pain, multitudes. And I have a question about the 144,000 versus the multitudes.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of seems like wiggle room. Well, we really can't say, you know, just, you know, but the passivity, the inevitability is hard for me because I would want to be more proactively working on behalf of humanity and God. I don't know. So I'm struggling with that part.
I appreciate you naming that, Pan, because it goes right to the heart of what distinguishes apocalyptic literature from prophetic literature. So when we're looking at the prophecies of, say, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, those are works that are prophetic in the sense that they're communicating to the people of Israel and saying, hey, y'all are going down the wrong road. You need to right the path. You need to make adjustments. You need to do this, that, or the other thing. Very often, you need to get back to worshiping Yahweh in the way Yahweh is supposed to be worshiped. Here in the world of apocalypse, though, there isn't a righting of the way. This is going to happen. This is inevitable. We're beyond the path of redemption. Now, you're just either in or you're out, and you're set up on a course to either be destroyed or to experience the oneness and fullness of God's reign on the earth. And so that is a really big distinction. Now, of course, whether we're thinking about the book of Daniel or we're thinking about the book of Revelation, the recipients, the audience for these writings were people who very likely thought themselves as one of the elect, as one of the 144,000 in the case of the book of Revelation, one of the countless multitudes, what have you. That doesn't justify, of course, the terror, the destruction, the pain, the suffering, the violence. However, it is very typical of this genre where there isn't room for redemption as there is in the prophetic writings. So it's helpful to name that, Pan, because it's just true.
But Pastor, what would as could one person, could me say, think of the fact that I could be a part of those 144,000?
I think absolutely.
Because I mean, I would like to think that I am, simply because of my hope and my faith.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, you know, and I think the other thing, though, is that when we look at that number, 144,000, all right, where did that come from? So in the book of Revelation, in that particular passage where that number first appears, it is a description of 12,000 people from 12 tribes of Israel are going to be saved. Other people see it as this sort of mystical reality because 12, when you take 12 and multiply it by the exponent 12, you get to 144,000, right? So there's this sort of mathematical reality that's at play here. And the same with the number 7. Why the number 7? Well, it was considered at this time period to be a number of divine completion. Why do we see the number 4 also in the book of Revelation? There are 4 beasts that are at the sides of the ancient one on the throne. Well, 4 was also considered a number about completion and sturdiness, squares, foundations, what have you. And so, when we look at the book of Revelation, we're invited to really think through, well, what's this book for? What was it for in its context? And what is it for in my own faith? And you may come to the answer, the book of Revelation isn't really for me. This is not kind of the way I want my Christianity to be represented, to be lived out, to be described and unfolded. And if that's the choice that you make, you would not be alone by any means. Looking back at the history of our faith, to its origins, you would not be alone in that. However, if you look at the book of Revelation and find in its imagery and the arc of the story something about hope, one way to gloss this is by using that quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice. That's about inevitability. That's about a reality that's inescapable. No matter what historical events may take place here, that arc of the moral universe is bending its way toward justice. That is the image that we get in the book of Revelation, in the new earth, the new heaven, the new Jerusalem. It's coming. You can't do anything to stop it. And so whether you believe that to be true just because of how you believe the universe is designed at a moral level, from a place of hope and love, or you believe that because you believe that there is a God who's orchestrating events and pushing reality in that direction, you can find sustenance, I think, for either view in reading the book of Revelation. And again, to our eyes, the amount of violence and devastation and destruction that is not just mentioned, but in a way celebrated in this book, I think for many of us is offensive. If we think about literature in the ancient world, we think about a world in which public executions were a reality, a world in which the gladiatorial games featured horrific violence. It was normalized in a way. I say this not to excuse it, but more to explain it. It was a reality in a way that it isn't necessarily for us in the same way. So, with all that said, and I'll hang back for a little bit because we're at time here, and for anyone who wants to keep talking some. But I'm just going to let you know what we'll do the next time we get together at Sue's house next Wednesday, September 11th. Next Wednesday, we will watch together The Matrix. If you haven't seen The Matrix, you will be in for a wild ride. If you have seen The Matrix, I still invite you to come and watch it with us or watch it on your own, because watching it in the context of this discussion, I think you might be surprised by what you discover. Because I'll just set it up a little bit. Remember those 3 things that we talked about, the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation having in common. Revelation is given by and interpreted by an otherworldly being. In The Matrix, there's a character who has that presence, who helps the main character understand what has really been happening. The veil is removed. Secondly, that being accompanies the seer throughout. That happens in The Matrix. Thirdly, the vision itself and the circumstances surrounding the vision are terrifying. That is certainly true. Now, and we also are in a universe in this movie in which there is a complete good and a complete evil. You have to watch all 3 movies to see where this arc goes. We won't be doing that. We will simply watch the first one. However, again, thinking about the time in which The Matrix came out, kind of around the late 90s, and the hysteria that was germinating around Y2K and technology and what technology could do and what it couldn't do. Phobias that still are part of our imagination in life today. As we look at the rise of AI and we look at the way technology is devastating the environment, this movie actually brings all those themes in. And I hope it will offer us some interesting fodder for conversation as we look both at this genre of biblical literature, apocalypse, but then also look at how it might apply to our lives today. And so with that, I want to thank you all so much for your comments and your thoughts and your questions. And I look forward to seeing those of you who can be there at Sue's house on next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks so much.
And I will